Hi, everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of statistical studies. So each statistical study is either observational or experimental. So we're going to start off with experimental. An advantage of this type of study is that the researcher has more control, right? It doesn't have to be in a natural setting. It could take place in a lab. But sometimes being in that unnatural setting is a disadvantage, right? Sometimes medicines might show certain results in a lab, but not when they're tested on people. Also, sometimes when you know you're being studied in an experiment, it might influence your response. Right? This is known as the Hawthorne effect. When this doctor knows she's being observed, she's more likely to use hand sanitizer in between patients. Experimental studies can also prove causation, that one thing influences another. This is where we're going to manipulate or change one variable, which is your independent variable, and measure how it affects the other, just the dependent variable. So typically an experiment is going to have two groups, a control group that is used for a comparison, who might be getting a placebo, which is like a sugar pill, and a treatment group that would be receiving the drug. The independent variable is the one that's being manipulated. So here, the independent variable is the different levels of the drug. The dependent variable is the outcome variable, in this case, blood pressure, the one you're measuring to see if it changed as a result of manipulating the independent variable. Right, and it also doesn't have to be limited to pharmaceuticals. There was an example done with some undergraduate college students where there were two groups and they were told to do sit-ups, but the one group was just told, do your best. The other group was told, try to increase your sit-ups by 10% each day, right? And both groups were measured like over a period of so many days. And in that case, the independent variable would be like the type of instruction, and the dependent variable was the number of sit-ups. And if you're curious, it did end up that the group that got the more specific directions of try to increase by 10% each day ended up doing more push-ups, even though both groups were randomly selected and they weren't necessarily more athletic. All right, so now we get into the observational studies. All right, this is going to draw conclusions based on observations, right? It could be data collected all at one time. It could be collected over a period of time. It could be past data that already exists. So this is going to create some disadvantages too, that like if the data was done in the past, there's no way to really ensure the accuracy of it. So there's not a lot of control with an observational study. Right? Besides the possibility that you could have inaccurate data and not know it because it was previously collected, observational studies typically occur in natural settings, like not in a lab where the researcher has more control. Observational studies could also be time-consuming and expensive, and they also don't really give a cause and effect, right? Like they show correlation. They could show two things are related, but they cannot prove causation. They cannot prove that one thing causes the other. So if observational studies have these disadvantages, why do we even do them, right? Or when do we do them, right? We might do them if a variable cannot be manipulated or when we don't want to manipulate a variable. So an observational study would be done maybe when it's like unethical to do an experiment, like if you're collecting data on suicide or rape or murder. Obviously, we're not going to experiment with collecting that type of data. But it doesn't have to be an unethical example like those. It could just be when the variable cannot be manipulated. Like, let's say I was testing whether gender played a role in handedness, meaning like if you're a male, are you more likely to be left-handed? Suppose we have a sample of 1,000 people. And we're curious how people's computer time relates to their blood pressure. All right, we might ask them how much time they spend on a computer. We might record their blood pressure. There's not going to be independent or dependent variables here because we're not measuring causation. All right, if we were just graphing the results to both of those questions and seeing how the variables like move together, right, we might be able to say that, higher blood pressure correlates with more computer time, but we would not be able to say that computer time causes high blood pressure in an observational study. This is because there could be something called a confounding variable that we didn't really account for. So in this case, the confounding variable would be the amount of physical activity someone has, right? Like typically people who are less active would have higher blood pressure, right? But people who are less active also probably have more screen time, right? So we didn't really test for that outside variable. On the experiment side, if we were doing this, we would probably have to decrease our sample because of maybe time or expense. So maybe we take 100 people. All right, we could randomly assign those 100 people to two groups. So there would still be confounding variables, right? Like the amount of activity that the people usually engage in. But this time there's going to be those confounding variables on both sides, right? So each group is likely going to have an even amount of activity level among their subjects. All right, so for our control group, we would say they have to spend maybe 30 minutes on the screen. The treatment group would be they have to spend 2 hours on the screen, and then we would have collected their blood pressure before and after the study, and then we would be able to show causality, right? Like we could then prove that more screen time increases blood pressure. Here's another visual of compounding variables. So you can kind of see like what at first might look like causality is actually not a valid claim. And then here's another example to help you remember it. It's kind of a silly one. I don't know why anyone would do a study between ice cream and sunburns, but temperature here is a really obvious confounding variable. Okay, so I'll leave you with a few examples where you have to decide which type of statistical study was used.